Hello, and welcome to another episode of Wicked Weird with New England Queenie. I'm your host, New England Queenie. We are back after a brief hiatus and ready to talk about all kinds of wicked weird stuff. During the break, I was still actively researching multiple topics, and I am looking forward to discussing some pretty cool ideas in the near future. I will continue to try to publish a new episode weekly now that we are in part 2 of season 1, and as always, listener communication is welcome. We are open to questions and show ideas, as well as guests who may not usually get the airtime to share their stories. It has been a bit since the last episode aired, and had I not been so wrapped up in doctor appointments and tests, I would have probably put this out sooner. Unfortunately, I acquired multiple disabling conditions following a COVID-19 infection in the spring of 2021, and they interfere with my daily life, often preventing me from doing basic everyday tasks. Over the last couple of months, I have had issues speaking and had used an AI voice to narrate the last couple of episodes, and listeners did weigh in that you all would prefer I use my own voice and take the time needed to rest so I could use it. I have long haul COVID and it has systematically destroyed my body, but I am still alive. I am lucky to have survived, even if my life is completely different now than it was before. Surviving something like this can change not only health, but also how you view life and what may come after. It's these thoughts that bring me to this week's episode of Wicked Weird with New England Queenie. What is the near-death experience and what awaits us on the other side? During the pandemic, our lives were flipped upside down. Some of those who contracted the virus had nothing more than a sniffle, while others were intubated and eventually would cross over in death. We tried to fight and sometimes would lose. The COVID virus was a game of roulette. You didn't know if your number was up or if you would live to see another day. The pandemic was the first time in my life I began to wonder about life after death. I wondered what was worse, surviving with multiple health complications resulting in poor quality of life, or just crossing over to what may be on the other side. I wasn't sure if anything at all was on the other side. I didn't know if once death came for me, if there was anything else, or if it was just nothingness waiting. These thoughts came more frequently as I saw my father become ill and suffer through the complications of COVID-19. Was there anything after we vacated our bodies? Were we all just shells holding our true form captive until we couldn't be contained any longer? How do we know there is a life after death that will prove to be our everlasting reward for our suffering? When my father fell ill in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, we weren't really concerned that he would end up one of the millions who eventually succumbed to the virus. I had been more concerned about my mother becoming sick because she was in end-stage kidney failure and on dialysis. I was working in the biggest post office in my state and had avoided contact with my family for months because I would have contact with hundreds of people a day. It was a time when people were home and started selling a lot online, so the number of parcels being mailed had skyrocketed. Oddly enough, a lot of people were using their off time from working to apply or renew passports too, and my office was one of the busiest when it came to these services. Customers would come in maskless and ranting about refusing to wear masks, and I was terrified of catching COVID from one of them and then passing it on to my family. Eventually, I did catch COVID from someone through my job, though I will never know for sure who gave it to me. I had only received the first dose of the vaccine when I was exposed to the virus, and it wasn't enough to prevent my illness. My parents and I had gone together to get the first shot, after I added them to my appointment. Unfortunately, their original appointments had been canceled because they lived in New Hampshire, and their original appointments were for location in Massachusetts. The state of Massachusetts canceled their appointments, so I called up the hotline I'd used to book mine and asked if I could add my parents to my appointment. The person I spoke to was extremely helpful and managed to add my parents on to my appointment, so they wouldn't have to wait 2 or 3 more months to get in. We met at the National Guard site in an old Sears to be vaccinated, and after it was over, my parents wanted to grab breakfast, so we stopped at the Red Arrow Diner in Concord to grab a bite before I headed into work. I had quite the reaction to the shot, or what I thought was a reaction. I developed a fever, and the headache I had been dealing with for the last few days got worse. More symptoms started to manifest. I went home early that day to sleep it off, but it just got worse. I would later find out I actually already had COVID, but I hadn't had it fully hit yet. I didn't see my parents for the next 10 days, and during that time I developed more symptoms: backache, painful gastric issues, difficulty breathing, high fevers, ringing in my ears. It was like the flu combined with a stomach bug multiplied by 10. I did go to work for a few days before finding out my dad had some cold symptoms. After much urging by us, he finally went to the ER where he was swabbed and ended up being diagnosed with COVID. They said he wasn't that sick, so he was sent home and told to rest, drink fluids, and to quarantine for a couple of weeks. We were all worried my mom would get COVID, and a couple of days later, she was at dialysis when she lost consciousness. They had called me, but I was homesick already myself and unable to get there, and I managed to get my niece on the phone to get in touch with her dad and stepmom, and they went to meet my mom, who was admitted to the hospital as high risk for COVID. My mom was pretty lucky. She only spent a few days in the hospital and recovered quickly. My father, though, began to deteriorate while still dealing with the infection at home, and he ended up right back in the ER. The same day my mother was discharged, my father ended up back at the hospital, but this time he was admitted. His condition had worsened considerably, and he needed to be on oxygen. At the time, we thought it would just be a few days, but we were just so wrong. I wasn't admitted for a few more weeks after I was first showing symptoms. I actually thought I was getting better when I took a hard turn for the worse. As sick as I was, my dad was so much worse. My dad was the strongest person I ever knew. He was always the best person anyone could meet. The day we heard they were going to put him in a medically induced coma and intubate him, it just felt like a nightmare. They did what they could, and when he was awakened after a few weeks, he mentioned that he thought he knew who got him sick. It only took one jerk who knew he was sick to approach my dad at his place of work to cause all of this. He never told us who it was that got him sick. All he ever told us was that it was a coworker who leaned into him and told him he was COVID positive, and within a week, my father was hospitalized. This began a 9-month battle that included a stint in a nursing home rehab, where he ended up with a giant open sore on his back and a case of pneumonia, which brought him right back to the hospital and landed him in the ICU again. He had surgery on his back to remove bone and infection, leaving a large hole. He coded multiple times, but what he told me about the coding was what caught my attention. As it turns out, my father and I bonded over our shared illness. He was much worse than I was, but we both suffered from long-term health complications. He also had experienced something he only seemed to be comfortable telling me about. He started talking to our family about having seen his brother, who had passed away years ago. He felt that he had come to him to take him to heaven. These visions, as we called them, continued through his hospital stay. He was intubated several more times over the months of hospitalization and even coded during a tilt table test. He coded several times during his hospitalization, and what he told me about his experience when coding was amazing. My dad had only what I could assume was a near-death experience. When he coded, he said he suddenly felt good, like he was miraculously cured. He realized he was floating above the doctors and nurses who were working on someone who had flatlined. He thought the person looked familiar, and then he realized it was him. Weirdly, it didn't really look like him, but he knew it was him. He felt free from the pain and fear. He watched them working on him, and he was ambivalent about living. He was happy and felt peaceful and didn't want to hop back into that physical body. He turned away from the body and floated into what he interpreted as a box. In spite of claustrophobic tendencies, he was comfortable in the box. He felt like he was waiting for someone to come pick him up. As the scene he was in shifted to that of a light, he felt his self be pulled violently back into his body, filled with pain and sickness. He was upset because he was in pain again, but one thing had changed for him. He was no longer afraid of death. He had a couple of more incidents after that, and he refused to pass on because his love for my mom and our family kept him here. It was only after we discovered he would never be well enough to return home did my mother tell him it was okay to go. The one thing my father could never bear was being away from my mother, and if he couldn't come home to her, then he didn't want to be on this planet anymore. In the months he was hospitalized and fighting to live, in between intubations, my dad talked about getting a cane corso dog when he went home and buying my mom a Norwegian forest cat instead of the house pony she so really wanted. He never lost his sense of humor. His hope of going home to my mother kept him here. He told me my Uncle Donald had come to him several times and told him specifically what he was going to die from, and he was right. My father's heart was failing him. The day before he passed, I visited him alone. He was off of a lot of machines when I thought he looked pretty good. He convinced me he was getting better. We watched some ridiculous Christmas shows that were really funny, and when I could see he was tired, I gave him a hug and told him I would be back the day after tomorrow. He hugged me really tight. He seemed so strong. My last words were, "I love you, Dad. I'll see you Tuesday." I never expected that would be the last time any of us would see him alive. So he passed on, and it broke our family. I became obsessed with near death and life after death. I wanted to believe that my father had experienced was proof that there was more to us than a shell made of skin, with some electrical impulses zapping a blob called a brain, causing us to walk around and think. I wanted to believe we had souls, and I wanted to believe I would see him again. Am I angry? Yes. I will never understand why this virus took my dad away from us, or why it left me physically disabled. Hearing about the near-death experience my father had gave me some hope he is still watching over us, but I will never know for sure if what I was taught in church is true during my lifetime. These are all things I can't yet understand. They are things we don't know much about because most of these trips that are taken to places like this, we don't come back from, and I won't be leaving on my own trip for many years to come. I read a lot about near-death experiences and found myself watching a lot of documentaries about people who had experienced it. And I found that what happened to them sounded a lot like what happened to my dad. Some of them saw a tunnel and light. Some claimed to have seen Jesus or Buddha or family members waiting for them. They all said they felt a beautiful sense of peace and love. They were no longer in pain, but then were pulled back into their bodies only to feel all the pain again. Some came away with psychic abilities, something I think my dad might have also developed because of how he kept seeing my uncle and knew heart failure was going to take him. His heart was only operating at 10% capacity from the damage due to COVID-19, and it ultimately was what took him. He was in a lot of pain and had many organs failing him as a result of the virus. My only comfort is knowing he is no longer in pain. We all are dying a little bit each day, and my hope is this isn't the only trip we make. I hope that tunnel and light are a portal to the rest of our lives. I hope our souls go on forever and we are reunited with our loved ones on the other side. Most of all, I hope we aren't suffering like this for nothing. That's all we have time for tonight. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Email wickedweirdpodcast@nothingness.com with questions, stories, or if you would like to be a guest on our show. Visit nothingness.com for updates and shop our store for all your Wicked Weird merchandise. Please like, share, and subscribe to keep up to date with new episode releases. This is your Wicked Weird host, New England Queenie, telling you to keep it weird. Good night.